Okay, here we go, showtime. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ed Pinero. I'm the Senior Vice President for Sustainability and Public Affairs for Veolia. Now, my colleague John from GE, who moderated the first panel, we actually overlap on a lot of different events, and everybody's heard of GE. I was going to say, unless you're from Mars, you heard from GE, but I'm sure the Mars rover has some piece of equipment with the GE logo on it. So but we're probably the largest company in the world that no one's ever heard of. But we're in the energy, water, and waste service provider space. So that's kind of how we fit into this whole picture. We have a history of working with Manu and his team here at the Water Center, a very innovative group. Manu picks on himself about being an academic. I think he's one of those few academics that actually gets it and it's in the reality world. And I'm just kidding. I'm just picking on you. Yeah, we always talk about that quite a bit. So this panel, and one of the challenges of being the later panel is you have to adapt on the fly. So I'm going to ask the panel as they give their remarks they've prepared their remarks and we gave them some questions in advance, but I'm hoping that they make adjustments as they go along to respond to some of the things that we've heard so far. So the first panel talked about challenges in large part. So what we're going to ask this panel to talk about are innovations that may be able to address those challenges. And I would put innovation in three buckets. There's the science and engineering bucket, and that's where you see technologies come forward and different approaches to operational issues. There's the business case bucket, and that's where you see discussions about financing and investment and just how do you make that financial business case for innovation. And the third bucket is governance, and that talks about water rights and policies and regulations and all these kind of issues. So the panel then is going to look at, when we talk about innovation, it's not going to be limited to specifically to technology. Yesterday, I was in Washington, D.C., moderating a panel on the energy water nexus. I was actually facilitating a discussion with the Advanced Energy Economy Group. And their space is a different energy approaches, renewables, distributed energy, and so on. And it was very interesting to hear some of the things that they brought forward in terms of innovation to deal with this energy water nexus from the perspective of the energy providers. But it was very similar that we've heard all day today. Investment, policy, business case, technology applications, all these factors all kind of came into play. So hopefully that'll kind of help drive us forward. So I'm going to just give you tell you who the panel is by name and association. I will let them drill deeper into their backgrounds if they wish, at the expense of some of their time, because it's going to be the same rules, 5 minutes each person. I thought I was going to be the real monster, and John he was amazing. So I'm going to look like the nice guy. But we're going to start off with Adam Schempf. He's a senior attorney and director of Western Water Programs for the Environmental Law Institute. And his background and work he's been doing has been in the space of water rights and allocation. We'll then move to Mark Robear. That's like Colbert, not Mark Robert. He's a partner with Water Asset Management, talking about water asset investment from that perspective. Then Ed Clerico, Natural Systems Utilities in the Clerico Group, water resource management issues. And then we'll finish up with Dr. Larry Susskind, who is the Ford Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning at MIT, which I think is in first place. No, I'm just kidding. we were running this college joke all morning, so I wanted to put a plug in for MIT, although I don't know how far down the list you are. But so anyway, we'll get started with Adam.
Well, thank you, Ed. So law after lunch, lucky you. I'll try to make this as painless as possible. Hopefully it will also be interesting. 5 minutes is probably going to be to your benefit, although I'm going to likely be running through a lot very quickly. And hopefully you'll have some questions at the end. I just want to tee up a lot of legal innovations, and then we'll see where the dialogue takes us. Before I get into those innovations, I would like to make two important distinctions for purposes of our discussion. One in water law is water quality law, which is primarily influenced by federal law, namely the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act, and water quantity law, which is primarily a matter of state law. I also want to identify the difference between surface water and groundwater from a legal standpoint. Both of these sources for quality and quantity purposes are regulated differently, different sets of laws for the most part, so that's important to understand. Since I'm going to be talking more about quantity than quality in these innovations, I want to note that the legal doctrines underpinning the management of ground and surface water are quite different between states. We've already had that highlighted so far. I understand you can't read the details of these maps, but they're just to show you how diverse, top being surface water, ground being lower being groundwater, the basic doctrines are between the states, and then even within those states, you're talking about a lot of variation. So you're really not going to get a fairly generic legal innovation that's really going to be broadly applicable, as someone had noted earlier today. All right, innovations. I'll break this down into a couple of different areas that I would like to cover. The first one is expediting water transactions. So particularly in your western U.S. states, which primarily rely on a system of surface water rights prioritized by the date of first use, some of the groundwaters prioritized the same way, make it very difficult to move rights to water from one user to another, whether permanently or temporarily. This can be really both timely and costly, time-consuming and costly. There have been a number of states that have been amending their laws to allow short-term leases to these rights to occur with less review, and hence they can happen faster and with less cost. So, as many of you could probably surmise, that allows for more rapid response, given the reduction in time, and makes smaller transactions more financially feasible. In some instances, we actually have transactions that are pre-approved and can be triggered by a particular event, such as a state declaration of drought. There have also been many water banks developed around the West, some just for dry periods, others that are more permanent, some with a great deal of success, and others that have failed. There has not been a universally applicable model, but I would say that there have been many lessons learned. Second, incentivizing water use efficiency. So again, primarily looking at Western states, anti-speculation has been ingrained into the water rights structure and requires the right holder to use the water or lose the right to it. This, as you might guess, disincentivizes efficiency. Now, there have been developments in this area. A few states have exempted saved water from this rule. Exactly what constitutes saved water depends on the state. Also, several states have allowed the transfer of conserved water, creating a potential incentive for improving efficiency. So not only are you getting rid of the disincentive, but you're actually potentially creating a market for this conservation. A growing trend, particularly among California towns, is requiring new development to offset its impacts on the water supply by retrofitting toilets and other fixtures off-site, allowing growth to continue while not having more adverse impacts on the sustainability of the water supply. With regard to rainwater and gray water harvesting and reuse, which we've touched on a little bit, water allocation laws, plumbing codes, health codes, all can be obstacles, but there have been some developments in this arena around the country. One real quick thing on reuse, I would also add to the conversation that we had earlier, legal impediments, particularly in prior appropriation states, so your western states, it's a big deal. You may see a lot going on in California right along the coast, but you get interior and it does not happen as much because you have to be concerned about the other right holders. I can go into more detail on that if people have questions. Third, protecting and restoring the environment. One of New York's greatest modern contributions to innovations in water management, at least in my opinion, has been in the Delaware River Basin and more or less with headwaters restoration and what it can mean for water quality. And all right, that's my time.
You had like 5 more seconds if you needed it.
All right.
Okay.
My name is Mark Robear. I work with a group that invests in the complexity that Adam just went through. So we invest capital in companies and assets that ensure water quality and water quality, quantity and quality. We invest globally in publicly listed companies, and in the private world, we invest specifically in Western water resources and their development. The complexity which Adam has alluded to is a great impediment. I mean, it makes your eyes glaze over when you hear it, and it puts a lot of people off as they think about how do we work water through to its eventual end markets. There is a tremendous mispricing of water, and I think one of the things I've heard today over and over and over again is technology is going to save the day. Technology without price will not work. You need price to justify investment. And I think until we get the pricing right, you're not going to get the investment. We can wait for, NASA-like programs to invest in water technology, but we'll be waiting a long time. The federal government is out of the water quantity solving problem. It's in the water quality problem, saving problem. So what we have is, from our vantage point, and if you think about it from an investor point of view, what do you look for? You look for abilities to deploy capital in areas where there is major mispricing, an obvious need, and complexity. This space hits all of those. Oh, by the way, it's a monopoly at times. It can be a monopolistic delivery mechanism. With that comes advantages and disadvantages and great responsibility. So from a very high level, this is kind of a business unlike many other businesses. And I don't think enough people focus on that. And I think if you want to really start focusing on change and innovation, you have to focus on the attributes that the industry has and also the risks that the lack of availability promotes from businesses, from municipalities' ability to grow, from health points of view, from political stability. I think for the Circle of Blue conversation, one of the great things to do would be to look at where was water scarce and where were political crises with sort of a time lapse. You could see how things evolved. And if we were to do that, we would have major revolutions in the southwestern United States, probably in Texas, if nothing was done. So from our vantage point, this is an area which is ripe for business. It's ripe for investment. And we feel that there are a number of things which are being done and which, quite frankly, you should be very proud of. And a lot of it has to be, its applicability of certain investment and approaches, using what Australia's done in their Murray-Darling system to bring it to specific basins here in the West, to focus on, I think, the development of the legal system needs to be greatly enhanced in this country. And I think there's also very big cultural differences in how water and resources are treated. If you went to Northern Europe is not an issue with water availability. They have some of the highest priced water in the world. They have great systems. They have culturally taken upon themselves to invest in quality and conservation. And so the messaging is, I think, from an American perspective, we are spoiled children. We cannot deal with the future has a cost, and we have to sort of confront that. So I think from a vantage point of the transmission of how do you get things done, it's attractiveness of capital. I don't think the market is pricing in the risks. We don't believe the market is pricing in the risks that are inherent in lack of supply and lack of water quality. And we think that the other messaging that has to happen is corporates have to be aware of the risks inherent in practicing business with lack of forward-thinking water policies. And I think the consumer goods companies and Pepsi and others are at the forefront of that because water is an input. But I think many other companies and municipalities need to take it into their equation as well.
Very good. Thank you. Ed?
My message is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be one about hope and aspiration because I really see the tides changing. And to the younger people that are here, don't be dismayed by all the pessimism that might exist and how difficult this is. Things are really happening right now. They're really affordable right now. And I believe the water infrastructure industry is going to look dramatically different in the future. And I want to tell you a little bit about why. To me, the water infrastructure industry is going to start resembling a tree more than it does currently resemble a Roman aqueduct. That's a linear system that takes resource in and puts waste out. And our societies are built around these models. We're addicted to them. We have a hard time moving away from them. And I'll tell you, it's happening right now in the water space with regards to water reuse and other things. So I'm going to just give you a couple of highlights around the benefits of trees. I mean, we all know the benefits of trees. All of these factors and features play into the benefits of infrastructure that's designed to behave and operate and to some degree look like a tree because it can provide us with the quality of life and the quality of water we've become used to in a way that's extremely functional today. So this analogy is simplified. I'll give you, water is complex. But let's start with a simple model, and let's rethink this aqueduct mentality from large and linear to smaller and resource recovery oriented. We all know that trees aren't all the same. Different species grow in different places, and they learn and they adapt. They know how to adapt. We need to learn how to mimic biology in a way that we adapt according to where we are and what we are supporting in terms of our life. And when I say integrated resource infrastructure, I don't mean just water. I mean water and carbon and nutrients together. It's where the real value proposition comes in that the economics are turned around. So as an example, we have now, right here in New York City, 8 operating water reuse systems in buildings, the latest being the new school. And the level of reuse is now up to about 60%. So the new school is using 60% less water than the other campuses in New York. And in that regard, they've stepped up one notch and they're reusing their water for laundry. I understand the clothes are brighter and whiter, and everyone's really happy with the system as it's functioning. There is so much we can do because we consume so little water that has to be potable. The fact that we're going to all the expense of building linear infrastructure to make pristine water that we then use to put our waste into is mind-boggling that we haven't moved past that concept yet. So going forward, I believe water reuse on a distributed scale will own the day and be the paradigm that we will move to. I also know that in New York City, as well as 13 other cities, it's now less expensive from a capital and operating standpoint to deploy distributed water reuse systems at this scale than it is for New York City to build new water capacity or wastewater infrastructure. The lines have just crossed this year. New York City had an incentive in place. They're going to keep it in place, we hope, for a while. But and going forward, you can see the incentive's not even necessary because now for $11 a thousand gallons, we can produce in the long term reuse water when New York City's prices are right now at $12 a thousand gallons. And we're seeing that happening across the country. San Francisco just introduced a capital incentive program, and they're beginning to implement distributed water reuse systems in San Francisco as well. The big problems are not the technology. The technology's here. The biggest obstacles are the existing power structure and how you fit within it, how you own and what the risk-reward model is for how these services get delivered with the same affordable, dependable services that the people are used to having and should have. And I will tell you, we had 80 distributed water reuse systems in the direct path of Superstorm Sandy. We didn't have one violation. We had 2 systems go out of service because the buildings that they were in went out of service, so no customer that needed service was without it. And that's dramatic by comparison to what happened to the regional linear systems that were in that storm's same pathway. Business-wise, it requires relooking at how we contract and how we procure these services, but models exist today that are functioning, and so I say to you, the future is very bright. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Larry.
I think we all understand that technology innovation will not get you from challenge to solution without the engagement of a variety of stakeholders in the process. I'm actually staring at the basic descriptor of this event. Partnering science with industry leaves out civil society. I don't think you can find a way forward between science and industry without civil society. I don't think the word governance would be the word I would use to capture this third set of innovations. If the first is technology, if the second is the business model, I would argue that the third is a kind of collaborative, adaptive management or some active way in which the people, the institutions affected by change from what is to what needs to be, participate both in defining the problem, thinking through what to do instead of what the status quo is, making judgments about what priority to give to what, dealing with the trade-offs that the finances require or that the distribution of gains and losses require, then monitoring whatever's being tried, then making judgments about how to adapt that, given the uncertainties and complexities mean that whatever you try will never be right the first time. All of those stages, I think the word governance makes it sound like the government's going to decide something, and before it does, it's having a meeting and telling people about it. And if they're going horrendously wrong, maybe those people will make a loud noise, and then maybe the people who represent them will do something. I would much rather look at a collaborative process from the beginning of understanding or diagnosing these challenges and sorting through what might be done about them. 5 quick ideas about how to make collaborative adaptive management, or CAM, work. The first is, remember, dialogue is not problem solving. And the notion that you had X meetings and you facilitated conversation, or you put information out, or you got the message across, none of that's problem solving. It's all a set of ingredients that might lead you to problem solving, but problem solving requires joint engagement in the kind of tasks that I was describing. Second, we need new systems of informal representation. We all know about Robert's Rules of Order and parliamentary democracy and all the ways in which representation is supposed to happen in the governmental realm. We're absolutely bereft of any kind of theory of practice about ad hoc representation of stakeholders in ad hoc problem-solving activities that are designed to supplement formal systems. We need new approaches to joint fact-finding. I don't want to wait until we have the answer before we engage people in a discussion, but how you deal with different levels of ability and different attitudes. The problem of the Gila chief standing there is that the U.S. government never lived up to the treaty obligations that it had to the Gila people, and so he's sitting there on a dry creek bed, imagining what might happen in the future. Who represents the government in the conversation with him ongoing? Not the state government. The federal government isn't talking to him. We have problems of who he represents. And does that tribe have standing to be in a country-to-country negotiation, the way in which First Nations or First Peoples think they ought to have? We've got no shared understanding of ad hoc representation of non-official government groups in collaborative problem solving. Fourth, I believe that when you bring together many parties in ad hoc problem solving, you need a neutral party to facilitate the conversation. Because anybody who's there to help you from whichever, from industry, from government, is going to be suspect in the eyes of some parties. That's why we have evolved a new profession of neutrals, mediators and facilitators. We teach people to do that. We certify them. There's a system, and yet we're still not seeing the use of trained professional neutrals in all these conversations. And finally, we need to create new forums, new spaces for informal problem solving. Not just online, although I think we can do it online, but even how you think about the design of a conversation space, very important.
Thank you. All right. Good group. Thank you very much. So what I'd like to do is, taking the cue from the previous panel, I'm going to ask each of these guys a question, in part stemming from some of the things they said, but also trying to tie in some of the stuff we had earlier. And then I'm going to go out to you guys right away so you can kind of chime in. If it gets really a lot of dead air, I have more other questions for them, but I doubt that's what's going to happen. So let me start with Adam. There's a quote that's incorrectly attributed to Mark Twain that says, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And you've mentioned a lot of these issues having to do with the rights, and you talked about reuse policy and the challenges as we move east across the country. If you had to put your finger on why is this still the case after all these decades and the examples that you raise of things that could be solutions, if you had to try and zoom in and say what would make this change, what's the issue?
Well, the problem is greater demand than there is supply. What would make it change, I would say it probably depends on how big of a crisis you're in and what kind of public willingness you may find in order to have a very significant change. What you've been seeing in a lot of Western states to this point has been mostly operating within the system that is in existence and trying to figure out a way to make it meet the needs that we currently have. And a lot of that comes down to transactions and trying to retroactively build back in some of these uses that originally were not conceived. We'll add environment to that. We'll add groundwater storage, some of the integration between groundwater and surface water. I mean, these are the legal developments that have been taking place. Is it feasible to see something that's, and in the riparian states, if not to leave the East Coast states out, building in a permitting scheme, what otherwise is a very equitably based, fuzzy feeling type of system, which has its own benefits. It makes it very difficult to really rein in uses and can manage how water is used. But going to a permitting scheme at least has the theoretical potential to give us something along the lines of what a market in the West might be able to provide. But could you do something more dramatic than that? I think it's feasible. It may require a fair amount of money, especially if takings issues really come into play. And that depends on how you're going to do it. And then it's going to require a fair amount of public buy-in. I think that goes to the lunch conversation on how big of a problem do people find this to be.
Okay. Excellent. So Ed, you had the nice tree model. The tree has managed to figure out a way to balance its carbon issue, its nutrient issue, and its water issue. Translating that model to the reality, what happens when you have say a low carbon economy has competing attributes to it that may not be the best water solutions or so on? So how would you try and reconcile, in the perfect world, a solution has the lowest carbon footprint, the best water footprint, and so on and so forth, but we know that's not the case. So how do you translate the tree model to us?
Okay, so first off, there's not a solution. There's not a tree. So there's a concept of mimicking nature instead of fighting nature, designing things in a way that we're sensitive to optimizing as much as we can around the water balance cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nutrient cycle. It's going to be different in different places. Give you a couple of examples. We never recognized in the beginning how much value there is in the thermal energy and wastewater coming out of buildings until we measured it and scratched our heads a little bit and then demonstrated that we can gain as much energy value from a building by converting that thermal energy back into hot water or chilled water going back into the building, that it makes up for all the energy consumed by the wastewater plant that's converting that water. So now all of a sudden you've got a water reuse system that's not consuming any water. It's actually improved the carbon balance for that building. We have a system in Ridgewood, New Jersey that takes biogas and converts it into combined heat and power. And by bringing in just a little bit of food waste from the outside, that system generates enough energy to run that entire plant. So as I start looking at water balance of 50, 60% reduction, now energy benefit increases from a coefficient of performance that go up dramatically. You do it on a case-by-case basis, and you do it to fit the needs of the community that you're serving and the dynamics of the economy in which you're located. So every tree is going to look a little bit differently. A tree in California is probably going to look different than a tree in New York, but we would expect that to be the case. And that's the approach.
All right, excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up
sure,
on that because
absolutely.
Larry made the point about convening stakeholders and how do you provide a forum in which ideas can be shared. And I think the issue is that everybody's dealing with different problems. There are solutions. Look, I'm very hopeful. Every single problem we're talking about today can be solved. Technology exists; it can be solved. It's a question of will. And what you do need is these groups of people who are informed, who've seen how things have been implemented, such as the Veolias and the Suezes and the larger, engineering firms. There is great commonality of problems around the world, and the solutions exist. The question is, how do you make that applicable for the local community. And I think to the extent that it's all about definition of risk, and so risk can be capital risk, can be costs, and it can be social risk. We haven't really talked about the social risks as much as, I mean, we know what the social risks are in the developing world, but there are social risks in Detroit. There are social risks in large parts of the United States because we are growing faster than we can sustain. So I think it's actually more measurement of risk, more holding people accountable to who is taking care of those risks and have they thought them through. And I think a lot of the people who are in this business live in quiet terror because they know the risks. They just don't want to come clean with some of the stakeholders.
So let me ask
We
you
can start at the page here.
let me ask you your question next, because actually it builds right on that, and that is your comment you made about pricing,
Right.
the whole issue of the value. What is it? Is it a matter of monetizing these risks? Is it a matter of alternatives, ways to look at water in terms of value? For example, trading, selling of water quality credits, and so on. What do you think is the translation from what you're saying to
Right, to
taking into
practice.
consideration these risk issues?
So I think it depends on where you are, and it depends on, in Ed's case, a lot of the adoption of his systems is due to the cost benefits to the users, both from an energy and a water availability side. So there it was a simple math equation. I think if you're an investor and you are speaking to a municipality that's issuing bonds for a system that may or may not have been kept up to snuff in terms of its capital investment over the past several years, and may have no plan as to what they're going to do when their water supply runs dry in 10 years, those are questions which need to be asked. So there is a sort of an analysis of risk. So I think, to me, it's transparency, asking questions which put the burden of proof on how capital is being deployed, and has it taken into account all of the risks that are associated with that. From our point of view, the agriculture, look, 80% of the water is used by agriculture. If you're going to try and find a solution to water availability, you got to deal with agriculture. It's the giant elephant in the room. And so how do you engage them? What costs do they put on their water? Many of them don't put any costs outside of the power costs. And a lot of them, because of the inefficiencies that Adam described about use it or lose it, are fearful of there's no incentive to become more efficient. So it's at the end of the day, it's asking the tough questions about, and how do you get that equation going in the agricultural community? You speak to their consumers. You ask Frito-Lay, what is the water footprint of your production base? And I think tying it into energy also makes it very relevant, because people are very aware of energy conservation. They're not so aware of water conservation.
Ed, you want to react to that?
I would just say, relative to agriculture, my opinion is you do it by demonstrating better agricultural practices that produce a higher return for the farmer and use less water, and that's very possible right now today. But these other forces are standing in the way. So what I've seen in all this, it's very complicated, but I like to relate where we've been to the green building industry, because it really helped us a lot. There was a movement started that wasn't governmental. It just lit up an industry around what can everybody do to make every case better the next case, and it started a competitive environment that just shifted an entire industry, and that will happen in the water industry.
And that's what we're doing. We're putting in place small-scale programs to create fallowing programs, which allow the leasing of water on a short-term basis to provide water supplies, and demonstrating to the agricultural community that these temporary programs can provide, an adequate return. They lead to better farming practices, and quite frankly, it incents them to maybe think about, hey, I don't need 50% of my water to grow what I'm growing presently. There's a higher value crop I could grow with maybe less water. Because a lot of the efficiency we've talked about in agriculture has been plant per acre. We have put out more, we have not focused on water efficiency. We focused on overall productivity, but the water efficiency has been lacking because it really hasn't been incented. Because everybody knows how valuable their water is, nobody wants to lose it. and they would be willing to share if they were adequately compensated, with the idea that it's their decision whether to sell or not.
And then I have a question.
I have a couple of quick points on ag. One, we haven't talked about the impact of the Farm Bill. I think that's important if you're talking about law and water and ag. Agriculture, at least in my experience in Western U.S. states, does not like being referred to basically as the sponge, the 80%. We're going to, that's where the water is going to be coming from. That's their livelihood. They also generally don't like, just from a general standpoint, don't like their water going to cities when they don't feel like cities are pulling their weight in terms of incentivizing, encouraging efficiency. They don't want waste in cities and then not being able to farm. You also have a really complex issue with communities. We saw it actually in some of the pictures earlier at lunch, that if you start pulling away some of the ag base in these small communities, you're losing the tax base, you're losing the payments to the technicians and the seed farmers or the seed salesmen and so forth, that start to unravel the economic infrastructure of these small towns, and you're going to have people effectively forced to sell when they don't want to. And finally, I would just flag the issue of consumptive use versus withdrawals. We haven't really touched on that, but at least in terms of Western states' water and prior appropriation, consumptive use, generally speaking, is where it's at. And if we're talking about reductions in conservation in ag, there is a lot about reducing withdrawals. It's still very much under debate how much you can conserve it from a consumptive use standpoint with these new innovations.
These are perfect comments that cue up the last question I actually had for Larry, so I'm going to modify it a little bit, and that is, you talked about, rather than talk about governance, looking at the collaborative effort and the different stakeholders, and based on what you've been hearing, do you think that we are either inappropriately characterizing or underutilizing the contribution that could come from various stakeholders? And I give a very specific example to kind of explain that question. Industry exists in these communities. They consume water, they're putting water out, but are they looked at, are we fully capitalizing and leveraging the potential contribution they could have to infrastructure? Or do we still look at them as another user in a municipal infrastructure and not really capitalizing as much partnership as could be there? Does that make any sense whatsoever?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
No, while the circumstances are different in each situation, I don't think it's a problem to make a general statement that if you don't tap the indigenous or local knowledge in a place and you're trying to do something about a problem, that you're trying to operate with one hand tied behind your back.
Right.
And farmers in a place know more about farming in that place than anybody else. So local industry knows what it does. It's not a question of whether or not people can contribute based on the local knowledge that they have. That doesn't mean it substitutes for expert knowledge, but you need to combine them. And too many people with expert knowledge don't know how to participate in a collaborative process that taps local or indigenous knowledge. So I think the simple answer to your question is yes, we are missing huge contributions. And again, I know you're America-focused today, but take every great river. If it helps you to think about the Mississippi, take the Mississippi. But I'd think first of the Nile and the current battle going on that looks like we made some progress in the last week between Ethiopia and Egypt and won't have a war over water. But you take every major river system. The transboundary management of those rivers is problematic. And it's because we've left it to states. I mean, even here, again, U.S.-Mexico for 100 years, we're fighting about the Colorado. And suddenly, right, in 2 years, we got a terrific agreement. We've got the same period, we got an agreement between U.S. and Mexico over oil and gas in the Gulf. How come, after decades of fighting, suddenly there was an agreement? Well, I think if you look at it, you'll see that people below the national level started working together informally and saying, we can't keep waiting for national leaders to duke this out. We're going to get together and we're going to come up with proposals, which because we've developed them jointly, both sides will be able to sell them up internally, then leading to agreement. So it's not just the technical knowledge that bringing people together in a more diversified way in terms of stakeholders can supplement, but also it's the credibility of what's ultimately agreed and its enforceability without having to spend huge amounts of money on enforcement because it's more believable, it's more credible. So we need ways of engaging all of those interests at every step of the water management process.
Excellent, excellent. So let me open it up. We already have somebody with their hand up over there and another one here. So you need here's our traveling mic.
I'll try to be loud. So to follow up on Adam's point and some of the follow-up from there, the question of engaging stakeholders, I think, is absolutely critical. My question to the audience, and I'll just give a little bit of experience and let it out for other people, is how do we engage the people that are the most at risk? So the lunchtime presentation showed some great examples of those people that are so on the fringe yet most impacted. Same can be said for lots of communities. So doing work in the Central Valley and Central Coast of California right now, those communities that are the smallest, most impacted by water supply and water scarcity, water quality issues, have nobody really being their voice, yet they need to be a part of the stakeholder process, but they need somebody to lead it. So that's where I think there's a failure to date in getting people in a position that can lead that forward, to engage them actively in that process, to come up with meaningful solutions that often they won't be able to participate in paying for. So that's an interesting gap, because it touches on Adam's point about the legal implications of those small jurisdictions not having the resources because they're small. And so I'm curious, how do you get those things to interact, and how do we move it ahead on a, not national level, I absolutely agree, but regional and smaller scale?
Can I quickly respond?
Yeah, if you, as many of you want to respond, if you could do it nice and briefly so we can get you all in and another question in.
So three very different strategies to responding to what was described. One is, you would be surprised about the extent to which people who are not organized to represent themselves in an ad hoc process, in fact, can get organized if they think they're truly being invited to the table and they're given the same resources to be in touch with their constituency that the more formally organized groups have. So one, they may surprise you and be able to find people themselves. The second is, we're very used to using surrogates to represent hard-to-represent constituencies. The issue is, what accountability do they have to that larger constituency, whether using online or other devices, but you can have surrogates. The third is that if you make these problem-solving conversations or this engagement of stakeholders not about decision-making, but about inventing good ideas, ideas that will meet the interests of all the parties, but that are proposals, not decisions, people will have an easier time coming together to be inventive, to share their thinking, and they won't be inhibited, and they won't need formal, legal representation, because there's not decisions being made. So we need to think about the problem-solving forum and what that says about who can represent themselves or need help being represented. And we need to think about the resources that stakeholder groups need to adequately understand their own constituencies' interests and how they evolve as learning happens during the process of working together.
Okay, you want to?
I'll just say I agree.
Right, yeah.
Can't get much more succinct than
So
that.
I would say I'm on the board of a water charity, and we focus on these kinds of underserved populations. Unfortunately, they don't have a voice, and they need help. They're looking for solutions. But at the end of the day, these communities and none of our we believe you got to work with the local communities, whether it's professionally or from a societal change point of view. But they need solutions, and they need ideas of how to go about building a system. If you have poor quality water, they need a system that allows them to invest in a treated water solution that could be financed by them and other people. And so it's a practical solution. But unfortunately, it's their voice needs guidance, and there are people there to help them.
I just want to really quickly agree. Essentially, I believe once you educate the people about the risk and you educate them about the options, when the urgency is adequate, there'll be a grassroots movement that can move mountains.
Excellent. A question here?
Yes, I'll try speaking from behind the column. Herschel Weiss, Ashokan Water. We see that water, unlike energy.
He's right here. He's good. He couldn't find you behind.
We see that water, unlike energy, is very regional. New York has an abundance of water, and Jersey City right across the river doesn't have enough because the pipe doesn't go there. How do we, I guess this is, jumps back to Pepsi-Cola, how do we not have money being spent by corporate America in the flagship arenas and making water reuse systems in Manhattan where we have way too much water, it's really not a problem, and not happening in the places that are not as gleaming, such as Jersey City, which really does have a problem. That's question one. And two is, how do we get corporate America to build their places where there's enough water? You know, they're not building big corporation factories up in by the Great Lakes. They're moving to Arizona and just causing more and more problems. I'm not sure who wants to jump
Actually,
on this.
here's how we'll handle that one, because that's a very intriguing question. We'll let the panel react to that. But Lisa's still here and Dan is still here. I'm not going to put him on the spot. But if there's anyone in the audience that would like to also comment on that question, because it's a very interesting point. You know, you look at where some of these, particularly some even manufacturing facilities that have a large water consuming, don't necessarily align with water availability, and there's many reasons, historical legacy reasons why this kind of stuff occurs. But wondering from the different perspectives that you have all talked about, if you want to take a shot at that, and then we'll see if there's other comments from the audience.
I'll take a quick shot. First of all, you're obviously from New York because the West is Jersey City as opposed to Arizona. Far West. That's extreme West. Anyway, I think actually corporate planning is now, industries are now much more aware of water availability before they site their plants. So you're not seeing semiconductor fabs built in New Mexico anymore. I don't think you're going to see a semiconductor fab built in this country anymore. And a lot of that has to do with varying things, but water is one of them. So I think actually capital allocation is starting to get it, that water is an issue, both water as it applies to availability of power and water as a feedstock.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to say that it's smaller than the regional scale. It's actually on a neighborhood scale that it varies. So you could go within New York City and you'll find the Bronx is going to be different than Brooklyn and Manhattan. And it's not just water supply issues. That's a benefit, but it's wastewater and pollution discharge as well. So New York's got a very serious combined sewer overflow problem and constrained pipeline flow that this addresses as well. And industries seem to me to be most lit up about resiliency, that they have their supply there, and that's driving them towards reuse when it's economical. They're going to go to the most economical approach, and as I said, I see that's changing now.
Did you guys want to take a shot at responding? Well, we have, is that a question, or are you responding to this?
No, it's a question maybe for Ed. And I totally support the distributed approach that you talk about, and I think if we're starting to build water and wastewater systems today, that's the way we would do it. Unfortunately, we have the infrastructure in place. We have a lot of cities with a lot of excess capacity, both on the water and wastewater sides, because industries have left and the residential customers are using less water. So the question here is, how do we get to the optimal solution given the fact that the marginal cost of water, where you already have the infrastructure in place and the capacity in place, is very, very low? And can we ever get there?
Well, the question for me isn't can we ever get there. The question is how rapidly and where will that change be the most dramatic. I think it'll be the most dramatic where the economics are going to drive it the fastest as wastewater rates go up. It's looking very positive from our perspective at the moment. I mean, New York City's rates doubled in the past 10 years. We thought that was pretty astronomical. Then we see that Washington's are at a 15% per year increase, and they're doubling every 5 years. I think that will really shift things, John, to be honest with you. And what will happen to the capacity that's there? We're going to have to rethink how we use it. And hopefully, I think, not spend good money on fixing a model that's outdated.
Okay, I'm getting the time warning here, so we probably have time for one more question. back there?
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you already have the microphone. Okay, yes.
I think it's on. Yes, hi, I'm Jeff Poten from Columbia. We've spoken quite a bit about utilities today, both as in terms of the challenges that they're facing in adapting to these new responsibilities, and also a great deal of innovation. We've also touched a little bit about the lack of incentives for agriculture and the use of the need to draw on indigenous knowledge. Well, the great way to create a nexus around that is to actually facilitate environmental markets for water, and we've been experimenting with this for probably over 15 years in the United States with only limited success. And the challenge really is how do we create markets at a local scale? Because unlike carbon markets, which can be global once they're fully activated, water markets will always have to be local. And the big challenge there is creating the right market dynamic, having enough buyers and sellers, and a way to tap into the innovation and provide the incentives to, in particularly in rural areas, to get farmers and other landowners to see value in water reduction, water use reduction, and pollution control. And the utilities can play a very big role as customers for this innovation, but we have to develop these markets at the local level, and we've only had minimal experimentation and even fewer successes at this point. So if the panel could speak to how we can activate these markets, I think that would add a new dimension to our discussion.
And to add to the challenge, you got about 30 to 45 seconds to do it. But however, I don't know if this is the kind of thing that will be discussed in the working session. So very quick response so we don't lose the train.
I would point to the Chesapeake and the Willamette and the efforts to create markets for ecosystem services rather than just for water. And so if you want to have more shade over rivers so that salmon will spawn in the Willamette, then you get farmers somewhere else to agree to plant more shade trees, and then the people that want to do certain things can buy those performance metrics. And those have been working in the Willamette and in the Chesapeake, and they've been producing a focus on ecosystem services. And the reason I wanted to raise that was that in the discussion of financing of water systems, whether municipal or otherwise, we've got to be sure that ecosystem services get valued as we're trying to improve productivity and efficiency. And if we don't take care, the water systems more generally will be destroyed in the process.
Okay.
And
last comment from the panel.
Oh,
okay, well.
All right, real quick. It would really help if we could actually value those ecosystem services better. And then I think unfortunately, you have to sort of silo this as the way it stands right now, water quality versus water quantity and what markets you're talking about. It'd be great if we could do them together, but right now, in Willamette example, it's quality, it's temperature. Other pollutants are going to be a little bit harder than temperature is necessarily. And then from a quantity standpoint, I would go back to water banks as an example of sometimes them functioning. If you'd like to talk later, I can give you more examples of those and how they don't function. And then on a broader scale, even within these local regions, you're going to have some social, some legal, some political obstacles to making these things work, but it's not impossible.
And we're doing it. So
there you go. Okay, on that note, let me please a round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much for your.
Thanks very much, Ed and panelists. I think we've continued the theme of learning quite a lot from these interactions. And we now move to where the burden is on you, the audience. So please check your tags, see which table you're supposed to be on, and then head there. And each table should have a moderator and a scribe. So you should engage in as much conversation as you can in a focused way, and not worry about whether or not you're getting recorded, because you are, but it won't be recorded. And then the moderators will present 5-minute summaries at the end, and then at that point, we'll have Michael Dean, who's the head of the National Association of Water Companies, give his reactions to what he has heard, and then I'll try to summarize whatever I have learned, which may be, impressive, right?